So let's talk about this mechanical joint pain. So, again, with mechanical joint pain, the muscles themselves aren't necessarily injured to the point where they're causing pain. But for the most part, there's some problem in how the muscles are either stretching or contracting, or the coordination of those muscles in between the rotator cuff and or the sort of scapula, that is causing the shoulder to move in such a way that's kind of sloppy or just not quite correct. And that puts more strain or stress on some of those surrounding structures, whether it's the capsule or the joint itself or some other structures in there. All right, so essentially, the cause of the pain is because of muscle problems. So this is sort of the most common thing. And this is sort of one of the things you were saying earlier, where there's a lot of pain into here. Almost all shoulder pain, 50% at least, as far as what we see, a lot of the pain is into here. But this can be a host of different things, which we'll see as we go through this. But here's the big deal about how this rotator cuff works. One of the things we haven't talked about yet is on the shoulder blade, there's kind of this overhanging bone in through here. So if you just put it on the top of your shoulder here, there's that sort of bony structure in through there. So basically, that's just called the acromion. That's where the clavicle attaches into it, and it comes right through the front bone here. But that kind of provides a little bit of protection if your shoulder is hit like this. It hits the bone instead of knocking your shoulder out of socket or something like that. The problem is it's an obstruction to movement in the sense of when you raise that arm up, at some point, you can have the potential where that's going to connect or hit in between there. Remember at the beginning when we were talking about that rotator cuff stuff, one of the big deals was, one of the lines of force was the rotator cuff can go down or depress the shoulder blade. And when you have, again, if you have this round head of the humerus on this flat head of the glenoid, what you want is that to kind of roll and slide and basically stay in place. And what has to happen to do that, if my arm's coming up like this, is muscles have to keep pulling this down, because there's other muscles on the top, like the deltoid, that are pulling it up. Right? So you have this force opposition. And really, there's only one or two muscles, these rotator cuff muscles, the one on the back and the front, this infraspinatus and the supraspinatus. It's really the only two muscles in the body that have this capacity to do this. If you may have a problem in those muscles, there's nothing to pull that down. So at some point, you're going to raise up and you're going to get this to pinch. And where it pinches is basically right there on the front of your shoulder. Okay? So what's hitting here? We have bones coming together, but what's in between these bones? There's a lot of stuff. Okay, first of all, we have a bursa, which is just sort of a fluid-filled thin sac that helps with sort of movement and keeps things sliding. So that can become pinched. We have the actual rotator cuff itself, right, because that's going to sort of come underneath that. So the top part of the rotator cuff lives in there as well. And we also have a bicep tendon. We think of the bicep as an elbow muscle that actually crosses and comes and attaches into the top part of this. So you have at least 3 structures that can physically be pinched in through there. Okay. And when that gets pinched, what happens is it causes pain, of course. Right? So this is an example of we have pain in one spot, but it could be a whole bunch of different sort of things causing that pain. So you can't say pain here is bursitis or rotator cuff. It's sort of pain here is because of pinching. And as we'll see, the ultimate question is what's not working properly to cause that pinch. But this is a common one, and we also have this in this backwards direction as well. This is what happens with throwers all the time. As you come back, right, if that rotator cuff isn't compressing, that sort of, and this humerus will actually slide forward, and it tends to pinch on the back, or it stretches or slides all the way forward, and that can hurt the labrum through there, and it can hurt the anterior capsule. So we can get some passive problems, and every time you're doing this or this, you're basically just getting that mechanical pinching or slide because you don't control. This exact same thing can happen with a problem, even if the rotator cuff is perfectly fine, but the shoulder blade is not moving properly. Okay? So again, under normal circumstances, that shoulder blade needs to be able to rotate up. If we talk about raising the arm straight up overhead, normally that's, well, 180 degrees of motion, right? So 0 to 180. So about a third or 60 degrees of that, it's hard to read that, 60 degrees of that should come from this shoulder blade rotating up. What happens as it's rotating up, it rotates that acromion process out of the way, right? So if we have that overhang, what happens is it sort of comes up, it's moving that acromion out of the way, so it creates space in through here. So even if that rotator cuff is working properly, and that's what we're trying to show in this picture, that that's still more or less sitting where it's supposed to, it still just runs out of real estate, and it's going to hit properly. So here's an example, again, you could have a bursitis, it could be a pinching of that bicep tendon tension of the rotator cuff, and these rotator cuff muscles themselves might be completely fine, but it's a problem with the shoulder blade. Right? So here's another example of more or less the same site of the injury, possibly even the same injury, but caused by two different sort of problems or mechanisms. Right? Everyone following this so far? Okay, so as far as mechanical joint pain, this is kind of the 4 or 5 most common things that we see. So the first one is this impingement syndrome. That's what we talked about when you're sort of coming upwards. You get that pinch in between that acromion and the upper part of the humerus. Another word for this is swimmer shoulder. This happens all the time in swimmers, because what do swimmers do over and over? They're doing this, right? It's reaching overhead, and plus they're getting neck moving all different ways, so it sort of messes up the mechanics into there, so you get that pinch, okay? We'll skip this for just a second. It's instability, this dislocation. This is what I said as we're sort of coming backwards with throwers, or if you have a job where you have to reach back and do some of this all the time. Same thing with people who get pain with doing flies or exercise or stuff like that. If that shoulder, that head of the humerus isn't sort of sitting properly, it's just going to slide forward, and that's what we call this anterior. It's called an anterior instability, but it just means that shoulder can slide forward. There's nothing to sort of check that motion. It just messes things up into it a little bit. That bursitis, like we talked about, you got that bursa in there. Bursa just basically is mechanical pain. You're just getting that pinch. It happens to be the bursa that's taking the brunt of that. Labrum tear. Everyone heard of a labrum before? So if we looked at that shoulder blade, but we turned it this way. So if you were looking this way at my shoulder, you have that round surface, and then you've got that shoulder blade coming at that. So we're kind of looking this way. So right around the outside of this, we kind of have a little ring of cartilage, and it's thicker here, and then it's thinner when we get to the middle. So it kind of forms a bit of a cup in through there, and that just helps with a little bit of extra shape, so it can make that flat head of that glenoid a little bit more concave. So it provides more of a socket for that to sit in. But this is different than the hip, where it's a bony socket. I mean, this is a soft tissue, very sort of loose socket. So again, if that shoulder blade, remember that round head of the humerus is sitting right in through there. If that's sliding and moving around, that's just going to butt up against that labrum all the time. So you can have labrum injuries, or what happens is that labrum can actually detach from it, so it starts to sort of shear off of that. So that can be a big problem. If it gets to that point, that's usually more of a surgical thing. It has to be reattached. But that's what we mean by